Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our opening keynote presentation. I'm very pleased to be introducing Peter Voser, Chief Executive Officer of Royal Dutch Shell, who also, as you just heard, received the Petroleum Executive of the Year award last night. Peter Voser may be a relatively lower profile leader than some of his peers or some of his predecessors, but make no mistake, he's a leader who, as they say, not only talks the talk, but he walks the walk. He's widely credited for completing Shell's successful recovery from the 2004 reserves crisis, restoring credibility to a company that had been shaken to its core. He's also transformed the company operations by increasing efficiency and effectiveness, and he's also led with a very disciplined and clear-sighted view on investment at a time which he described last night himself as ripe with opportunity. For these reasons, it's no surprise that he received the Petroleum Executive of the Year award. And I know we're all eager to hear what he has to say this morning, so without further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to him. And so please join me in welcoming Peter Voser.
Thanks, Tom, for this nice introduction. Good morning, everybody, Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first say a big thank you for the award which I received last night. I was truly honored to get that award. And as I said last night, this was not for me, this is actually for all the people in Shell, because they deliver Shell day in, day out. Now, it's a real pleasure to be back here and talking this morning at the Oil and Money Conference. And it's also an opportunity again to reflect at this time of uncertainty for our industry. The macroeconomic outlook remains volatile despite signs of recovery. And the summer saw a surge in the oil price due to the instability in parts of the Middle East. Right now, you could be forgiven for not looking beyond the end of 2013. But I believe we are at our best in our industry when we look into the long-term future. It is clear that the future will bring enormous opportunities and challenges as global energy demand surges. So today, I will stress the need to preserve and to continue investing in new supplies, in new technologies, and in our people. None of this is easy or cheap, but we must remember it could bring enormous benefits over the longer term. So let's first step back and consider the big picture. The coming decades will see a historic change in human society and global economy. Billions of people are emerging from poverty in China, India, and other emerging countries. They are buying their first fridges, cars, and washing machines, and all the consumer goods we take for granted in the West. Those same countries are undergoing rapid industrialization and urbanization. Now, this will transform the world's energy system. Overall demand could double over the next 50 years. It is true that North America's shale oil and gas revolution will relieve some of the pressure, especially if it is repeated elsewhere. But it can only be part of the answer. Over the next 7 years, the world could generate new energy demand equivalent to China's entire energy system today. You also have to consider the impact of declining production in mature oil fields. According to the International Energy Agency, crude oil production from fields that were producing in 2011 will drop by nearly 2/3 by 2035. That lost production would exceed OPEC's total crude oil output in 2011. Now, other events, as we have seen, have intensified the pressure as well. Japan recently closed its last operating nuclear reactor for safety inspection. So prior to Fukushima, Fukushima tragedy in 2011, nuclear power provided around 1/4 of the country's electricity. To cover the shortfall, Japan has increased its energy imports. In summary, supplying the world's energy needs will be extremely tough. According again to the EIA, the world will need to invest some $37 trillion in the global energy infrastructure between 2012 and 2035. Let me just repeat, it's $37 trillion, not billion, trillion dollars. That works out at an average of $1.6 trillion a year, or around $30 billion a week. That's the inescapable reality. So how should our industry respond over the next decade? Our first priority must be to invest heavily in new supplies and to maintain it through economic and political turbulences. Failing to do so would be sure a path to another supply crunch and major price volatility. The cornerstone of this investment must be a sound balance sheet, one strong enough to withstand volatile energy prices and revenues, and flexible enough to underpin billions of dollars of investments in new energy sources. So we must balance this investment with a prudent financial framework, generating the cash to repay debt and provide shareholders with an attractive return. But this is an approach for the longer term. One advantage is that it means we can access oil and gas trapped in difficult or remote locations. A lot is talked about the Russian subarctic and the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I recognize that these projects are all daunting. In some cases, 5 or 6 partners can be needed to provide specialist expertise in drilling and construction. Our major deep water and LNG projects can now cost tens of billions of dollars. That's a far cry from the 1990s, when mega projects cost several $100 million versus the billions today. But the challenges of these projects must not obscure their vital importance. They are powerful engines of growth and profitability for our industry and play a critical role in supplying the world's energy needs. Let me use one example. The Sakhalin-2 project is a prime example. It's Russia's first LNG plant and one of the largest integrated oil and gas projects in the world. Building offshore platforms in the Russian subarctic pose major challenges for our engineers. The sea is frozen for 6 months of the year, and air temperatures can fall to -40 degrees Celsius. Sakhalin also sits in the middle of an active seismic zone, so we had to safeguard the platforms from this danger. You also may recall the relations between the original shareholders and the Russian government were severely tested in 2005 and 2006 due to concerns about costs. But I'm delighted to say today that the project is now a major success story for all partners. The LNG plant reached full production capacity in 2010, and it provides nearly 9% of Japan's LNG. Shell and Gazprom have entered into a strategic alliance agreement to expand our cooperation there. So I think this project is a great lesson that perseverance and long-term thinking do bring rewards in our industry. That leads me directly to my second priority, which is innovation. During difficult times, it is possible to lose sight of why this matters. This is especially true in our industry, where scaling up technologies can take decades. But innovations is a precious investment in our future competitiveness. So, for example, in Qatar, Shell is converting natural gas into liquids, fuels and chemical feedstocks at our massive Pearl gas-to-liquids plant. This $19 billion investment was the culmination of about 40 years, 40, of research and refinement to perfect this technology. For countries like Qatar, with vast reserves on gas, gas-to-liquids technology provides a way to get more value from their resources by carrying gas into new markets. It took around 4 decades to bring Pearl to fruition, but it is a project that will provide returns for Shell and Qatar Petroleum for decades to come. Let me use a third example. Our Prelude project is another good example. Work is well underway and will become the first floating facilities to process, store and transfer liquefied natural gas at sea. It will be the largest offshore floating facility in the world. It will be used to tap the Prelude gas field more than 200 kilometers off Australia's northwest coast, a field that is too small and too remote to be economically developed in the traditional way. This massive display of technological know-how will eliminate the need to devote land and pipelines to process LNG onshore. It will unlock significant reserves of gas that otherwise might not be tapped. At Shell, we first started a floating LNG work program back in the mid-90s. And the front-end design phase for the Prelude facility involved more than 600 engineers in the Netherlands, in France, and in South Korea. We estimate that Prelude floating LNG will generate tens of billions of dollars of revenues over a 25-year lifetime. So new technologies in our industry can take decades to develop, but they can also bring decades of rewards. Perhaps the best way to invest in the future is to invest in our people. We need people with the technical and operational skills to build and manage difficult projects. And safety management must be at the core of their expertise. It's vital to restoring public trust and confidence in our industry. Last month saw the official opening of Shell's new Wells Learning Hub in Sarawak, Malaysia. It trains well operators to the very highest operational and safety standards and is the first of its kind in Asia. The hub uses advanced simulators to recreate the experience of working in well operations. Its training programs are open to professionals from across the region and from other oil and gas companies as well. In fact, the hub has already produced 800 certified well operators. It will help Malaysia to tap its deep water resources. An example, Shell is developing the Gumusut Kukup deep water field in partnership with Petronas and other companies. It's expected to produce 135,000 barrels a day of oil equivalent a day when it's fully up and running. So these projects can only be delivered by people trained to the highest operational and safety standard. Now let me finish by looking briefly a little bit longer down the road, so beyond the next decade. I think our industry should retain the courage and the foresight to explore new opportunities and markets. I'm talking about opportunities that could blossom in 20 or 30 years' time. To help us understand the future at Shell, we draw on the expertise of our scenario thinkers. For 40 years, this team of experts has produced independent analysis of the global energy system. Their new report assesses how major social, economic, and political forces might unfold over the 21st century and their impact on the energy system. The scenarios highlight several areas of promise. For example, biofuels can play a major role in removing CO2 from the transport sector, with oil use expected to increase until at least the 30s. Natural gas could play a growing role as a transport fuel, especially if global gas supplies continue their rapid expansion. Gas-fired power would support the growth of electric mobility in the world's growing cities, following the urbanization trend. We could also see increasing numbers of trucks fueled by LNG and cars by compressed natural gas. The scenario suggests that carbon capture and storage technology will be critical to taking CO2 out of the power sector over the next 50 years. And this is because fossil fuels will continue to supply the majority of global energy for decades to come. So I'm not suggesting this is going to be easy, ladies and gentlemen, but they could be the bedrock of our future competitiveness. And we must never undervalue the future. That's a critical message to keep in mind at this time of uncertainty. It's true that our industry faces strong short-term pressures, but we also face an inescapable reality. The global energy system is in the early stages of a historic transformation, as we earlier already heard. The best way to respond is by investing in the future, in new supplies, in new technologies, and most importantly, in our people. History suggests that perseverance today can lead to major rewards tomorrow. With that, I close my speech. Thank you very much.
I wanted to open up, we have a few minutes for questions. I want to open up by following up on your talk this morning, and you emphasized the need to persevere in investment, and that this is sort of a huge challenge, but something the industry needs to persevere, which is, maybe at odds with what some of the analysts and some of the sort of mood is at the moment. But I'm wondering to what extent the ability to persevere with these investments is dependent on the kind of high oil price that we have now, or level of oil price we have now, and the prospect of a higher oil price. How are these things tied together?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we are a very conservative industry, but also Shell is a very conservative company. And I think we are one of the very few ones which is actually publishing the way we look at our projects from a pricing point of view. So I think today we look at projects in the $70 to $110 range from the oil side. And for the Henry Hub scenario, we look at $3 to $5. So I would say you would not expect us, as a company like Shell, to be always at the higher end of that. So you're most probably somewhere lower down there. And therefore, what I would say is actually at today's prices, or even at prices between $90 and $100, I would see most projects being developed. Now, there is clearly, it needs capital discipline. It needs cost management. It needs, as I said, the right skills and sufficient people available to build these projects. And if that cannot be satisfied and the returns are not high enough, then most probably a company like Shell, we would not invest. But today, we clearly have more opportunities we can develop. So we are actually not cash constrained. We are actually we are not project constrained. We are actually more cash constrained in that sense. Not because we don't have the cash, but we want to have a discipline in the way we operate and the way we invest. So, but I would say current oil prices are slightly below, most probably everything will be developed. So we are not banking on $50 or $100 more. That's not the way we have been working for a long time.
Okay. And in terms of the investment cycle itself, I mean, this is a notoriously cyclical business. Does the kind of outlook that you're talking about presuppose a structural shift in the investment cycle, that we're going to have a sort of a continuing very high level of investment going forward? Is that what the world needs?
I think the world will need it, given the demand growth which we see mainly in emerging countries. I think the investments are also needed because we have a natural decline. So every year we are losing 4 to 6% through natural decline. If you calculate that, that means every 2.5 years roughly we need to build a new Saudi Arabia on a global basis, just to give you a sense of what that means. There's a lot of talk about the revolution on shale gas and light tide oil. Yes, it's a revolution in North America. In the rest of the world, it still has to be proven. I think there is a hype around that which really needs to be first explored and then built. So those impacts will most probably not be significant this decade. It will take really into the next decade before you see that. So therefore, I would see in high investment levels in conventional and in unconventional resources to go forward. Because if we start to slow down, the price volatility, when the demand goes up again and the demand goes faster up than what we can do on the supply side, will be enormous. Maybe just as a rule of thumb, the moment you find a molecule in the ground, before it actually hits your market through production, it's typically an 8 to 10 years time horizon you need to take into account. So the supply is a very slow-moving and reacting area, whilst the demand, once it starts to pick up, will pick up very fast.
Just one, before I open it up, one more question on gas. I mean, Shell has been a real champion of gas as the fuel of the future, and leader in LNG and GTL and so forth. And in fact, I think the company has slightly over half of its reserves in production in natural gas as opposed to oil. But given the margins and the prices on gas, and also this abundance of opportunity that you described in oil, is there any reconsideration of that enthusiasm for gas at Shell?
A few comments here. No, we see the long-term gas demand growing faster than oil, and hence that's where we think we as Shell can play a role in developing the integrated gas solutions, being it either gas to transport, gas to chemicals, gas in LNG, gas to liquids, fuels, and that's where our strength is through technology. Therefore, so higher growth. We have more than 50% of our production already today in gas. It's quite clear that gas has an enormous advantage from a climate change CO2 point of view versus coal and other energy components, 50 to 70% less than coal. Therefore, we see a long-term future. As I said before, I look at the US as a domestic market at the moment with some export potential going forward. The rest of the world, the shale gas still has to be proven. That will take, let's say, a while. We see 3 pricing structures around the world. It's a low pricing structure in the US, and then we see a middle ground structure in Europe, and we see a long-term driven market, oil price linked market in the Far East. So I think I would not talk today about the global gas market. I would still talk about the regional gas market. And therefore, at Shell, for example, we are whilst we are producing slightly more than 50% in gas, if you look at our exposure from a profitability point of view, given that a lot of gas contracts are oil price linked, we are actually between 70 and 80% oil price exposed. So that's where our margin is coming from. So one thing is look at volumes. When you look at the financials, we are still much more oil price driven than we are gas price driven.
Good. Well, we're going to be exploring some of these themes later today in the conference. I'd like to open up the floor to some questions.
I'm Amir Piver from BBC World Service. If there's anyone in the room who knows Iran, it's better than you. It's yourself and Mr. Domajri. In light of the recent developments, political ones, and also the reshuffle in the Iranian oil ministry, how hopeful you are to go back to that country with the ambitious plan Mr. Zangane has introduced? I know the sanctions are still underway, but given all things go well in the next 6 to 1 year, which is the timescale Iranian politicians are looking at, how hopeful you are to go back to Iran?
Now, thanks for the question. Let me answer this in a more general sense rather than in a Shell-specific sense. Obviously, we are all complying with sanctions and they are in place, so that's quite clearly we are all following that. I think there is a political solution, hopefully, at the horizon over the next few years. And I say this because the vast resources Iran has in terms of oil and gas and I've just explained how the world will need these type of resources. I think in the longer term, the Iran hydrocarbons will and have to be developed in order to actually feed the world market. So in that sense, from a general point of view, in the longer term, I would see Iran being back into the hydrocarbon energy market, but that depends on the political solutions, and I leave that, as I normally do, to the politicians, and I keep focusing on the business.
Yes, Marcelo Martinez from Tech Petrol, Argentina. You described the three scenarios for natural gas price, U.S., Europe, and Far East. Do you really trust that U.S. can keep long-term development of dry natural gas at this price scenario? Or is it a reflection of what happened in the last 2 or 3 years of a glut in natural gas? I mean, is it sustainable $4 or $5, or we'll need to see better prices for dry gas development? Thank you.
No, thank you. A few comments around this. It's obviously a function of demand at the end, so how much demand and energy policy in the U.S. will push into the gas market and how much exports will be there, and that will determine how much supply we need to deliver. I think with today's knowledge, quite sufficient gas can be developed up to a price of $6. So when you look at the cost curves, the complexity, it would suggest that sufficient gas can actually be available for exports, but also for a switch from coal to gas-fired powers in the U.S. into transport, into chemicals, feedstocks, into, let's say, heavy industries, etc. But there is a moment where the demand curve could drive the prices up significantly. So that's big point to start with. The second one is a lot of companies like Shell, but we are pretty much unique in the sense of the skills which we have. We are trying to use the gas and change the Henry Hub exposure into what I call a liquids exposure. And that's when you take the gas molecule at its lower costs into a chemicals plant, so a cracker, or into a GTL, or into transport, because this all gives you oil price exposure at the end. So you will see some of these developments happening as well. And then the gas price becomes a secondary issue rather than, it's rather the oil price which is important. The third one, which I would just like to get some realism into the discussion, a lot is talked about, and that links your questions with your question, about low gas prices for the rest of the world because Henry Hub will start to be exported in that sense. If you take a $4 to $6 Henry Hub, when you deliver the LNG into Asia, you are at $10 to $12. If you deliver it into Europe, you are in the $8 to $10. Now, if you take the last 3-4 years, in Europe the price was between 6 and 11, so there's no big difference there. If you go to Asia, if you take the contractual volumes and prices, it was between 10, 11 to 15. Again, you are in that bracket. So I think this whole arbitrage of gas is actually, in my opinion, a little bit too highly played, because once the product is landed in those areas, it is actually no longer a very cheap resource. It's the same resource as it comes from somewhere else.
Okay, well, I think we're about out of time. I'm sorry I can't take more questions. But I'd like to just close by asking you to thank Peter for his time and his remarks, and we'll move on to the next session.
Thank you.